to us how to do security for IoT. Please.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to explain how to do security for IoT, but highlight some of the problems and some of the possible mitigations that can be undertaken. So I did this a couple of weeks ago at CNOG, and I was in an IPv6 sandwich that time, and now I'm in a policy sandwich, but okay. Hopefully, there have been some developments in the past 2 weeks. Hopefully the people that were at CNOG 2 weeks ago, it's not going to be completely the same talk, but so this is about really how IoT is what we call a shared and collaborative responsibility, and also going to introduce a little bit something that an initiative that we have at the Internet Society called the Online Trust Alliance and the Online Trust Alliance IoT Framework. So, okay, so what's the problem? Well, you know, by pretty much any estimate, we all agree the number of devices that's going to be connected to the internet is going to be growing, and it's going to be pretty large. By some estimates, it's going to be something like 2.5 times the global population. The global population is about 7 million, so we're probably talking here about 20 million, did I say 7 million? I meant 7 billion. So we're probably talking about 20 billion devices possibly by 2020, maybe less, maybe a bit more, but it's certainly going to be pretty large. It's pretty obvious that as more and more devices get connected, that also means a corresponding increase in privacy and security risks. And the real sort of issue with a lot of these IoT devices is whilst, you know, things like routers and switches and sort of classical internet devices, they're often installed, you might argue, by sort of more expert users. A lot of these consumer type devices that are typical of IoT, they're not going to be installed by expert users or used by expert users. So a lot of the consumers at whom these devices are targeted are just simply not aware of a lot of these issues. And the sort of type of risks we're talking about, you know, potentially devices that may be controlling door entry, controlling webcams, also maybe controlling your, you know, central heating system. And then, of course, you know, it's just simply your own, you know, personal data. Some of us have got, for example, password managers. We've got maybe some confidential information put on network storage devices. So that's the sort of internal problems. But then we also have, you know, a lot of these devices that may be in many cases unmanaged, very insecure. These can be used and have been used for large-scale IoT-based attacks that have attacked mainstream internet services, you know, across the globe, and actually brought them down for several hours. And in some cases, it can even affect people's safety. You know, certainly, there's been incidents recently where malware has been targeting industrial controllers, the SCADA-type devices, which do potentially control critical infrastructure. Now, this is a real threat. So this is a slide from Symantec, who've tried to sort of measure the sort of typical number of threats to a home per day. You know, so typically 8.3 malware attacks, 5.4 potential bot attacks, and so on. Maybe 1.2 phishing attacks. That's been sort of ongoing for a long time. But although some of these are actually, you know, maybe newer types of attack. And just to give you some practical examples, so in 2010 there was an issue with TrendNet webcams, which allowed, well, they were transmitting login credentials in the clear, and also storing these credentials on mobile apps unencrypted. So basically anybody that obtained their IP address could actually log in and view the video stream. Probably not something that you want if it's actually inside your house, if anyone can look at that, particularly as a lot of these are used for, you know, baby cams, baby monitors. 2016 there was a Mirai botnet, which is a huge DDoS attack launched against Dyn, big DNS provider, and that was, you know, largely using IoT devices, targeting Linux-based peripherals, and using default logins, to infect them with malware. And that affected a number of major services across the internet, including Netflix and Amazon, for example, PayPal. Bit of more of a slightly theoretical attack was a Jeep SUV. And this used something, well, there's a number of vehicles using something called a CAN bus, which interconnects the various control devices on a car, allows them to be connected together. And researchers were able to use cellular networks to actually hack into that, change the firmware, and actually control some of the devices that control the brakes and the steering, for example. And then this is the sort of latest development in the last week. So in 2017, there was an issue was found with a number of cardiac devices, so pacemakers that go into your heart, which had vulnerabilities in their transmitters that allowed device data and remotely share this. Now, I was at a conference last week, at the Trainer Networking Conference in Norway, and actually the keynote talk was by a researcher who actually had a heart pacemaker installed. And she was pretty interested in, how does this work, and what problems are there going to be. So she went and investigated this, and was pretty shocked to find out that you can upload the firmware with TFTP, which is a little bit worrying. If your heart is depending on this, and in fact, they had to do this to herself because she actually there was a bug in her firmware, in her heart pacemaker, so they had to upload a new version without any security. So that's a real issue. And in fact, although this particular problem wasn't, as a result of an actual hacking or an actual attack, her heart was actually giving incorrect pacing and putting shocks in the wrong place, so her heart wasn't given in the correct rhythm. So, this is a real effect. Of course, only 2 weeks ago we had VPNFilter, which was targeting certain routers and network storage devices, using known exploits and also targeting default credentials. Looks to be towards spying on traffic, overwriting firmware to either make it non-functional, or also there was another option or version of the software which is looking around for industrial control systems. And this is sort of a bit of an annoying one because it's persistent. Devices need to be factory reset to remove that malware. So even if you're able to remove this as a user, it's actually pretty disruptive because you need to know all the settings that you've configured to put everything back into working order again. So even if it's not actually doing any actual damage, it's just annoying because you have to spend time and effort, and potentially you don't know what those configuration settings might be. So this led to maybe having a bit of a look around my own house and just seeing, okay, what are the challenges there? And I've by no means got a lot of IoT devices. I'm not really a sort of IoT geek. I was a few years ago. I was pretty frustrated with the sort of lack of integration that was possible, so I, to some extent, slightly gave up on it, sort of waiting for the future. But actually, just looking around, I've got a lot of devices on my network. Around 30 devices that are currently actively in use. From smart televisions to network printers to a number of iPads, iPhones, routers. Plus I've got a lot of old devices lying around as well, which they may not be turned on, but potentially someone could turn them on, and then you don't quite know what the security vulnerabilities are there. I've also got some home security devices as well, so for example cameras and burglar alarms and some remotely controlled light switches that you can control via the internet. But I'm a reasonably astute technical user, and I pretty much try to do the right thing. So I went out and bought devices that do support, supposedly secure access, SSL, TLS, devices that support IPv6, devices that you can configure the security, so I can install my own security certificates, for example, ones that will do encrypted data transmission and storage. So I've done all the right things. I also have a reasonable idea of how to do network monitoring. I used to do this quite a lot, work in this area quite a lot in the past, so I can actually install software to go and find out what's happening on the network. But the reality is, I'm really time poor and I'm not at home very much, partly because I'm here at this conference, so I can't always be monitoring things. And I've really got little idea of who these devices are all communicating with and actually who's communicating with them. I've really got no idea what data is being collected and where that is going. And perhaps more concerningly, a lot of these devices have stopped being supported. Usually after 1 or 2 years, you don't get any more firmware updates for these, and you just have to sort of rely on pot luck and hope that the devices haven't been hacked or there's not some vulnerability there. But perhaps, even more worryingly, so a lot of the secure aspects of these devices have now been deprecated. So, give you an example of the network cameras. I've got VivaTech, which were quite expensive, and they do have, a TLS option. Well, TLS version 1 has been deprecated, and they don't support anything above TLS. So, I can now either not access them, or I have to revert back to unsecure access, which kind of pretty much defeats the purpose of having a device that you can securely access. So, this is actually a problem. So it was once secure, now it's not secure. So, we're all here because the internet offers, convenience. We all see the advantages in this. It's brought a lot of benefits to mankind and to the world. But it's also creating this, increasingly creating this platform for more of, which is creating a bigger and bigger risk. And one of the issues is a lot of the IoT devices today are just being rushed to market without a lot of consideration for even the most basic security and privacy protections. And some of the issues, for example, are sort of very limited interfaces. I talked about, the insecurity of the webcam. Some cases you don't even really have an interface. They're just, you have to connect with a remote mobile device. You don't really know what that device is doing. You can't really see what's happening on the device itself. Many of these devices are embedded. In some cases, people are bringing devices onto your network, but you don't really know what's happening. And then, of course, there's a sort of limited upgradability and patching, particularly in devices that have got a long service life. Light switches I do not want to be replacing every 3 years. I want them to have 20, 25-year lifespan if I put them in my house. So there's sort of 3 issues here. One is the vulnerabilities of the devices and sensors themselves. You've also got the apps and the platforms that are controlling those. And then you've also got the cloud and web services that some of these, or in fact many of these, are actually connecting to. So there's 3 touch points there, there's a number of issues with respect to the life cycles of these, but also who is retaining the data and who owns the data in all of this life cycle, this ecosystem. And then, who's responsible? Well, actually lots of people. You've got the platform developers, the protocol developers, the app developers, the platform operators, the device vendors. Those are just the devices and the services themselves, the people that are provisioning these. But then, of course, you've got the retailers who are selling these devices. You've got the network operators who are providing the connectivity to these devices. There's a responsibility for the policymakers and the regulators. But then, of course, also the users. Do the users need to take some personal responsibility for what's being installed on their home networks? There's 2 aspects you need to think about. One is the sort of inwardly looking aspect where you're focusing on potential harms to your own security and safety and privacy. That's within your own network and on your own devices. And potentially, if those are compromised, how is that going to impact your personal information and your personal safety? We've also got to consider looking outwards as well, because if malware is installed on some of these devices, they can be used for DDoS attacks, also help spread other malware, other botnets. So, having compromises on your own devices might not only affect you, it might also affect, many other thousands or millions of people. I just want to sort of make one observation, which I've observed about this myth of low-cost devices. It's often claimed that it's not economical for vendors to maintain low-cost devices, but I would point out here that my PCs and router that I used, my router is a Draytech, they were actually cheaper than my smart televisions and cameras. So I paid a lot more for the smart televisions, I paid a lot more for the cameras, but yet the routers still get firmware updates after 5 years. I'm still getting updates for my operating systems. I would point out I'm not running Windows 7, but that's still supported if you are running Windows 7. And I'm getting periodic updates actually for the most cheap devices on my network. But the camera, which was expensive, 400 euros, and there's 2 of them, that had regular updates for 2 years, and then it's had nothing since. And now all the security features are deprecated. So, this is an issue. So, presumably it is possible to provide ongoing support if there is a sufficient critical mass, and then, how can that be encouraged and mandated even? So I think pretty much everybody would agree, something must be done, but, what is this something that must be done? So basically, at the Internet Society and through the Online Trust Alliance, we're really looking to get manufacturers and suppliers of IoT devices and also the services that they connect to adopt, a certain baseline of security and privacy for consumer protection. And the sort of basis of this is something called the Online Trust Alliance, which was founded as an industry trade organization about, probably 11 years ago now. It originally had 65 members, some very big names there that were involved in this. And that was there to promote best practices for protection of user data, to promote best practices in user security, and how you hold data, how you hold the data of users. So in a sense, being a self-regulatory body and promote best practices amongst the members. This merged, OTA and the Internet Society merged last year, in April last year, and the OTA members became ISOC members at that point. But the OTA still is now an initiative within the wider Internet Society. Okay, but there are 40 different, at the last count, IoT industry bodies. Why is this one different? Well, one reason is that we're trying to take a much broader multi-stakeholder approach to looking at the IoT risks. And a lot of the other IoT industry bodies are sort of focused on particular aspects and not taking a holistic view of all the different aspects. So, as we've got quite a broad range of stakeholders, broad range of which were former OTA members but are now ISOC members, we use this as a basis of developing what we call this IoT Trust Framework. So this was a consultation with more than 100 device manufacturers, also retailers, also a number of security and privacy experts, and we've also been talking to consumer organizations as well. So this culminated in the publishing of the IoT Security and Privacy Trust Framework actually 2 years ago, which has been updated several times, and latest version is version 2.5, which came out last year. So this has around 40 principles over 4 key areas, which aim to secure IoT devices. So the first one is security, so ensuring that devices use cryptographic protocols by default. So don't use TFT for heart pacemakers to upload the firmware. Make sure only necessary ports are open and services are being provided that are simply necessary for the functioning of that device. But then also regular monitoring, providing regular monitoring of these security settings, and providing patches where security flaws are found. Also, with respect to user access and user access credentials, insisting on strong authentication, encrypted storing of credentials, so not in plain text, and also implementing anti-brute forcing measures, so providing some sort of access control to the device. Third aspect is privacy aspect, so actually manufacturers disclosing what data is going to be transferred, only collecting data which actually has users are actually affirmatively agreeing to, but also, and I think this is an important point, declaring, what is the life cycle of this product, making a commitment to say, well, we will support this product for, say, 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, and we will agree to provide patches for that. We will agree to monitor that device or ensure there's monitoring of that device for this specific period. So, for example, you're not buying the smart TV that you get 2 upgrades to and then nothing else, and that was an expensive TV. So the manufacturers and the vendors are making this commitment to saying, we will support this device for X amount of time, so that you can actually, make a judgment when you're buying the device. Okay, I'll know that this has a certain lifetime, it has a certain amount of support, and you can make a consumer choice on that basis. And then the last one is actually, if you're having to communicate with users, say via email or other methods, you provide authenticated messaging. So it can be verifiable that that message has originated from the vendor or the service provider. So that's the aim, is to sort of maybe avoid phishing attacks. So what? There's other IoT frameworks, but generally they are focusing on specific areas such as interoperability, security. We think that OTA is really the only IoT framework out there that's covering all of these different aspects. And it does have this backing from over 100 stakeholders, and they're from industry, government, consumer advocates. And I think importantly, several leading manufacturers, they have agreed to support this framework, or to support the principles of this framework. And there are actually several retailers who are planning to use this framework to actually determine whether they'll carry products or not. So if a product isn't conforming to these principles, it won't be carried by the store. And one example, there's a big retailer in Australia called Coles. That's one of the organisations that signed up to it. Another are in the works. That at the moment we're just going through the legalese. But certainly we've got some quite significant backing for this. And we're also working with consumer testing organisations. So the initial aim is to produce rankings of products. How well do products rank against a security framework? So maybe consumers can make an informed choice about different products and how they perform in security and privacy. We've just signed an agreement with Consumers International, which is a big association of consumer advocacy organisation, a big international federation. So we've got their backing. And we've also developed this in consultation with the NTIA IoT multi-stakeholder process. So, it's got some significant backing. So really what we're trying to do is 3 things. One is working with the manufacturers and suppliers to actually adopt these principles. Whether they sign up to the OTA Trust Framework or not, we'd still like manufacturers and vendors to adopt these types of principles. We're also trying to influence consumers to actually make better, to demand security and privacy features on their devices, and actually select products that perform better. It's a difficult business, of course, to do that, but that's one of the aims that we have for this. But sort of in the longer term is also then encourage actual policy and regulations to actually push for better practices in IoT devices as well. So we'd prefer industry self-regulation, but you know, equally, this is not incompatible with actually you know, policy implications and sort of governmental pressures as well. So these are the sort of asks we have. You know, we're asking for people's help. We don't want this to be seen as an internet society thing. You know, this is a collaborative framework that we would like people to adopt and everybody can help with. So really, we're trying to get in touch with you know, manufacturers and suppliers that do provide these sorts of products and encourage them to adopt these principles. You know, certainly we know who a number of the manufacturers and vendors are, but you know, certainly in places like Slovenia, as we were 2 weeks ago, probably in Romania as well, there actually are a number of vendors of these products that we might not be aware of, so you know, please raise awareness of this, point them in our direction. But also, you know, help spread the word about the privacy and security risks of these devices. All of these slides are freely available. You can use them in your own presentations. So if you want to go and talk about this, we're perfectly happy for you to use these materials. Also encouraging policymakers to better support these features. Already discussed that. Make policymakers aware of these types of recommendations, whether it's OTA or whether it's these very similar best practices. You know, it's very important that IoT vendors and service providers are adopting this. But also, you know, we're also looking for key events and also other partners to help broaden the awareness. So if there are any sort of IoT conferences, IoT workshops, you know, NOG events where we could talk about this, we're very happy to hear about this as well. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. If there are any questions.
Okay, Kevin, at the beginning you said that you are in the sandwich or something like that. So IoT is a salami here. So, do you have any questions for salami?
So, I would just like to share one potential horror story. Yeah. So, you know, I'm building a house, and now I'm looking into this, what to put into my house, and I found this brilliant, very nice front door lock, smart lock, that you can open remotely and lock remotely, and it's very nice, very functional. But then I go and read the frequently asked questions. What happens if I lose my doorknob or my phone is without battery? And it says, oh, find another phone. Here is this number, call this number, and our operators will be very happy to open your house for you. Thank you very much.
I'm sure they're using all kinds of voice recognition, right, to prove it to you.
Any more comments or questions?
Well, I've got maybe one other observation. You know, one reason I sort of stopped installing IoT devices in my house a few years ago is you know, simply that they demanded that you connect to some third-party service that it wasn't clear what they were sending or what control you would have over those devices. And you know, I just simply have not found any suitable control system which I can actually keep control of these devices myself. So if there's anyone out there that wants to build one, I would be very happy to hear about it.
Okay, if there is no questions, thank you, Kevin, for a nice presentation.